Sleeping Beauty. Hello everybody, my name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you a story Nori. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who had no children. They were so sorry about having no children that I cannot tell you how sorry they were. At last, however, after many years, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening for the baby princess. The king and queen looked throughout the kingdom for fairies to be her godmothers, and they found 7 fairies. Each fairy godmother was to give the princess a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days. In this way, the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the christening ceremony was over, the whole party returned to the king's palace, where there was prepared a great feast for the 7 fairy godmothers. There was placed before each one of them a magnificent case of gold, in which were a spoon, knife, and fork, all of pure gold, set with diamonds and rubies. But as everyone was sitting down at the table, they saw a very old fairy whom they had not invited, because she had not left the tower where she had lived for over 50 years, and she was believed to be either dead or under an evil spell. The king could not give her a case of gold as the others had, because they had only made 7 for the 7 fairies. The old fairy felt insulted and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard how she grumbled, and guessing that she might give the little princess an unlucky gift, went, as soon as they rose from the table, and hid behind the curtains. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest wished that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the intelligence of an angel. The third, that she should have a wonderful grace in everything she did. And the fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. And the fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn came next, and shaking her head with more spite than anger, she wished that one day the princess would have her hand pricked by a needle on a spinning wheel, and that she would die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody began to cry. At this very instant, the young fairy came out from behind the curtains and spoke these words aloud. "Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true, I have no power to undo entirely what the elder fairy has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a needle on a spinning wheel, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her." The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, immediately made a law by which everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to use a spinning wheel, or to have any spinning wheel in their house. About 15 or 16 years later, on a day when the king and queen were busy in a far corner of the vast palace, the young and beautiful princess amused herself by running up and down the corridors and going up from one apartment to the other. Eventually, she came into a little room at the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her wheel. For this good old woman had never heard of the king's law against spinning wheels. The princess said, "What are you doing there, good old woman?" I am spinning sheep's wool into the thread so that I can knit it into a cardigan." "Ah," said the princess, "that's very clever. I've never seen that done before. How do you do it? Give it to me so that I may see if I can do the same." Now, whether it was because she was in too much of a hurry, or whether it was because she was clumsy, or whether it was because the old fairy had wished it so, I cannot say. But no sooner than the princess took the spinning wheel than she pricked her hand on the needle and she fell down into a faint. The good old woman, not knowing what to do, cried out for help. People came rushing from all over the palace, and they came in great numbers. When they saw the princess lying in a deep, deep sleep on the floor, they threw cold water on her face. They loosened her clothes. They struck her on the palms of her hands, and they rubbed her temples with smelling salts. But nothing they could do would wake the princess. And now the king, who heard the great commotion from the far end of the palace, remembered the terrible warning of the fairies, and guessing what had happened, came rushing to the tower. There he saw the princess lying in a deep, deep sleep, and he ordered her to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. If you had seen her, you might have taken her for a little angel. She was so very beautiful, for her swooning away had not paled her complexion. Her cheeks were like roses. Her lips were like sea coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which persuaded everyone that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly till her hour of awaking was come. When this accident happened to the princess, the good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep for 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 miles away. But she quickly heard the terrible news from a little dwarf who had 100-mile boots with which he could tread over 100 miles of ground in a single step. The fairy came immediately, and she arrived at the palace about an hour later in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king took her hand as she stepped out of her chariot, and they both went to look at the sleeping princess. As the fairy was very good at thinking and planning ahead, she realized that in 100 years' time, when the princess would wake up, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace. And so this is what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace: nannies, maids of honour, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, cleaners, guards, pages, footmen. She also touched all the horses in the stables and fields, the fierce guard dogs in the outer court, and pretty little Mopsy too, the prince's little puppy, which lay by her on her bed. Immediately, as soon as she touched them, they all fell asleep, so that they might not awake before their princess, and that they might be ready to serve her when she wanted them. Even the great fires in the ovens of the kitchen, that were just then roasting partridges and pheasants, fell asleep too. All this was done in a moment. Fairies do not take long to finish their business. And now the king and the queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and made an order that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all round about the palace grounds such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, entwining one another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very tops of the towers of the palace. Nobody doubted but the fairy had demonstrated a very extraordinary sample of her power, and that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years had passed by, the son of a king from another family had gone a-hunting in that part of the country where the palace used to be. He asked, "What are those towers in the middle of that great thick wood?" Everyone answered with the rumours that they had heard. Some said that it was a ruinous old castle haunted by spirits. Others that all the sorcerers and witches of the country used to meet there at midnight when there was a full moon. Most people believed that there was an ogre that lived there, and that he used to take to there all the little children he could catch, so that he could eat them up whenever he pleased, without anybody being able to follow him, as only he had the power to pass through the wood. The prince was all in a quandary, not knowing what to believe, when a very good countryman spoke to him as follows. "May it please your royal highness, it is now about 50 years since I heard from my father, who heard my grandfather say that there was then in this castle a princess, the most beautiful that was ever seen, and that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be waked by a king's son." The young prince was all on fire at hearing these words, believing, without thinking these things through, that he could save the princess, and pushed on by love and honour, he swore that moment that he would do just that. As he rode on his horse toward the wood, all the great trees, the bushes and brambles gave way to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, and he went into it. And what rather surprised him was that none of his people could follow him, because the trees closed again as soon as he passed through them. However, he did not stop. A young and amorous prince is always brave. He came into a wide outer court, where everything he saw might have frozen the most fearless person with horror. There was a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. But the prince realised when he saw their red faces and pimpled noses of the guards that they were only asleep, and that their glasses, in which there still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they had fallen asleep whilst drunk. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the corridor, where guards were standing, with their rifles upon their shoulders, snoring as loud as they could. After that, he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came into a chamber all gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed the most wonderful sight that had ever met his eyes, a princess who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and rosy beauty was quite angelic. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees and kissed her hand. And now, as the evil fairy's spell was at an end, the princess opened her blue eyes for the first time in 100 years, and looking at him said, "Is it you, my prince? You have waited a long time." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her more than anyone or anything in the whole wide world. Their conversation did not make much sense. They spoke with little reason, but a great deal of love. He was more lost for words than she, and we need not wonder at it. for it is very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very agreeable dreams about handsome princes coming to her rescue. In short, they talked 4 hours together, and yet they said not half what they had to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awaked, and as all of them were not in love, they felt most desperately hungry after 100 years without a bit to eat. The chief lady of honour grew very impatient and told the princess aloud that supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed and very magnificently, but His Royal Highness took care not to tell her that she was dressed in the fashion of 100 years ago, like his great-grandmother. She looked not a bit less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great hall of mirrors, where they had supper, and were served by the princess's officers. The orchestra played old tunes, but very nice ones, and after supper, without losing any time, the priest married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honour drew the curtains. They had but very little sleep. The princess had had too much of it recently, and the prince left her the next morning to return to the city, where the king was anxiously waiting for him. And that's the end of the first part of The Sleeping Beauty. If you want to know what happened to the prince and the Sleeping Beauty after that, you'll have to listen to the next story, Nori. Prince Bertie the Frog would like you to meet all his new friends at his lovely green and purple website. You can see what he looks like there. So drop by at storynori.com. For now, from me, Natasha. Bye-bye. The second part of The Sleeping Beauty. Hello, everybody. My name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you a story, Nori. And so, in a moment, I'll be telling you the second part of The Sleeping Beauty. But first, here's a piece of gossip I've picked up about Bertie. As you know, Bertie used to be a handsome prince, but now he's a frog, and he's a bit sad about that, which is why he listens to Story Nories on his iPod to cheer himself up. Down on the pond today, Bertie is feeling an extra bit sad. He's really glumming around. Sadie the swan, who between you and me always takes extra special notice of Bertie, said to him, Poor Bertie, you look so pale green today. What's wrong?" "Oh, I don't know," said Bertie glumly. "It's just that I think I miss the lovely Princess Beatrice." He croaked for a bit before going on. "You see, she was so very, very beautiful, and I just really miss her." "Oh, Bertie," sighed Sadie, "that's just about the saddest thing I've ever heard a frog say." Just then, Colin the carp interrupted them. "That's because Bertie's the only frog you know," he snapped. Colin is a very grumpy carp, and he can be quite rude sometimes. "Be quiet, you silly fish," said Sadie. "You've no romance, no love. No, well, it's all so sad. I just don't know what to say." "You could tell me how to become a prince again," said Bertie. "Well, I've got an idea. Today we'll tell a special story full of love and romance. Oh, it will be wonderful, and all the children will listen, and then you can be a prince again." "Oh, no, not another soppy story," said Colin the carp. "That'll only make him go on about the lovely Princess Beatrice even more, and we'll all die of boredom. What Bertie needs is a good old-fashioned fright. That'll empty his green head of all your romantic nonsense." Sadie was most unimpressed by Colin the Carp's speech, but Bertie says he's willing to give anything a try once. And so today I'm going to tell you a rather scary story. Do you like scary stories? You won't be frightened? Just a bit. Well, I think I might be just a bit frightened when I tell you about the ogress who wanted to eat up the Sleeping Beauty and both her little children. If you listen to the first part of the story Nori called The Sleeping Beauty, you will know that a handsome prince discovered a Sleeping Beauty in a palace in the woods. She had been fast asleep for 100 years, but when he kissed her hand, she woke up and fell in love with him. They were married that very day. The morning after the handsome prince had married the Sleeping Beauty, he left her and returned home to the city where his father, the king, was anxiously waiting for him. When he reached home, the prince said that he had lost his way in the forest as he was hunting, and that he had slept in the cottage of a farmer who gave him cheese and brown bread. He did not say a word about the Sleeping Beauty, let alone how he had married her. The king, his father, who was a good man, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded it was true. And seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, and that he always had some excuse ready for so doing, though he had slept out 3 or 4 nights together, she began to suspect that he was married, for he lived with the princess for over 2 whole years, and they had 2 children, the eldest of which, who was a daughter, was named Morning, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day. The queen spoke several times to her son, to ask him how he passed the time, but he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared her, though he loved her, for she was of the race of the ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her money. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogreish inclinations, and that whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to stop herself pouncing on them and gobbling them up for a snack. And so the prince would never tell her one word about his beautiful wife and 2 little children, but instead kept them a secret. His father died about 2 years later, and although the prince was very sad, he became lord and master both of the people and of himself. A month later, he announced his marriage to the cheering crowds, and he led his beloved wife, the former Sleeping Beauty, in a great procession to the palace. They made a magnificent entry into the capital city, she riding between her 2 children, for now he was king, and she was queen of all the land. Soon after, the king went to make war with the Emperor Contalabute, his neighbour. He left his wife, the Sleeping Beauty, and his 2 children, Prince Day and Princess Morning, in the care of his mother. His war went on all summer, and after a while his mother, the ogress, said to the Sleeping Beauty, "Why don't you go to visit your old palace in the forest, my dear, and see that everything is in order there? And I will look after little Princess Morning and little Prince Day." And so the Sleeping Beauty went to visit her old palace in the forest to see that everything was in order there, and she left little Princess Morning and little Prince Day in the care of the king's mother, for she did not know that she was an ogress who craved to eat little children for dinner. As soon as the Sleeping Beauty was gone, the queen went into the palace kitchen. She said, "I have an idea to eat little Morning for my dinner tomorrow." "Ah, madam!" cried the chief cook of the kitchen. "I will have it so," replied the queen. And this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat. "And I will eat her with a cranberry sauce." The poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with ogresses, took his great knife and went up into little Morning's chamber. She was then 4 years old, and came up to him jumping and laughing to take him about the neck, and asked him for some sugar candy, upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went back into the yard and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such a good sauce that his mistress assured him that she had never eaten anything so good in her life. But in truth, he had saved little Morning, and carried her to his wife, to hide her in a hut he had at the bottom of the courtyard. About 8 days afterward, the wicked queen said to the chief cook of the kitchen, "I will eat little Day for my supper." He answered not a word, being resolved to cheat her as he had done before. He went out to find little Day, and saw him with a little sword in his hand, with which he was fencing with a great monkey, the child being then only of 3 years of age. He took him up in his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might hide him in her bedroom along with his sister, and in the place of little Day he cooked up a young goat, very tender, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. And so far all was well. But one evening this wicked queen said to her chief cook of the kitchen, "I will eat the Sleeping Beauty, and you will cook her with the same sauce I had with her children." It was now that the poor clerk of the kitchen despaired of being able to deceive her. The young queen was turned of 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had been asleep, and how to find a beast of the size and shape and firmness puzzled him. He decided that to save his own life he must kill the Sleeping Beauty, and so he went to her palace in the forest, meaning to do just that. He put himself into as foul a mood as he could possibly manage, and came into the Sleeping Beauty's room in the palace with his dagger in his hand. When he saw her beautiful face, he could not bring himself to kill her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the Queen Mother. "Do it, do it," said she, stretching out her neck. "Execute your orders, and then I shall go and see my children, my poor children, whom I so much and so tenderly loved." For after hearing of the Queen's orders, she thought that they must be dead. "No, no, madam," cried the poor chief cook of the kitchen, all in tears. "You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. But then you must go home with me to my hut, where I have hidden them, and I shall deceive the Queen once more by giving her in your place a young deer for her dinner." And so he led her to his hut, where, leaving her to embrace her children and to cry along with them, he went and dressed a young deer which the Queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite as if it had been the Sleeping Beauty. She was so delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king on his return, how the mad wolves had eaten up his wife and her 2 children. One evening, when she was rambling round about the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in a ground room little Prince Day crying, for his mamma was sending him to bed without supper because he had been naughty. And she heard at the same time little Morning begging pardon for her brother. The ogress knew the voice of the Sleeping Beauty and her children, and being quite mad that she had been tricked, she commanded next morning by break of day, with a most horrible voice which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she ordered to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all sorts of serpents, in order to have thrown into it the Sleeping Beauty and her children, the chief cook of the kitchen, his wife and maid, and all whom she had given orders should be brought there with their hands tied behind them. They were brought out, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub when the king, who was not so soon expected, entered the court on horseback, for he came post, and asked with the utmost astonishment what was the meaning of this horrible spectacle. No one dared tell him, but the ogress, all in a fury to see what had happened, threw herself head first into the tub, and was instantly gobbled up by the ugly creatures she had ordered to be thrown into it for the others. The king was very sorry, for the ogress had been his own mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and his pretty children, and they lived happily ever after. The end. That was indeed a rather scary story, although it had a happy ending. Do you think Bertie has forgotten all about the beautiful Princess Beatrice? To make certain, go and visit him on his lovely green and purple website at storynori.com, and be sure to cheer him up with a few jokes. If enough children keep listening to his stories, one day he will turn back into a prince. So keep listening and tell all your friends to tune in to storynori.com. I'll be telling you another story Nori soon, but for now, from me, Natasha, bye-bye. Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Hi everybody, my name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you the story Nori of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. But first, here's a piece of gossip I picked up about Bertie and his friends. As it happens, it was a bit of a gloomy and rainy day down in the pond. Bertie was trying to think of a trick to play on Colin the carp, but was finding it a bit difficult. Just then, Barker the dog ran up to the pond. "Woof, woof," said Barker. "Oh no," said Tim the tadpole. "Barker has stolen some sausages from the kitchen." And sure enough, 3 fat, juicy sausages were hanging from Barker's mouth. Now, Bertie was a bit nervous of Barker, because he was a very big and bouncy dog, which was all very well when you're a prince, but is a bit scary when you're just a frog. But if there was one thing that Bertie was even more afraid of than Barker, it was the palace cook. Do you know why Bertie was afraid of the palace cook? You haven't heard? Well, I'd better explain. You see, when Bertie used to be a prince, sometimes he would get a bit peckish. And he used to creep into the kitchen and take some biscuits and some cake and sometimes even some chocolates. The cook would get very cross and chase him out of the kitchen with a rolling pin in her hand. So when Bertie saw Barker drop the sausages by the pond, and he saw the cook running down the path, he was a bit afraid, because the cook might think he had stolen them. "Where's that stupid dog?" shouted the cook. "Woof, woof," said Barker, running away and leaving the sausages behind. "Quick, Tim, hide those sausages," croaked Bertie. "I haven't got any legs," squeaked Tim. Colin, hide the sausages," croaked Bertie to Colin the carp. I haven't got any legs either," said Colin. "Anyway, I don't like sausages." "Oh no," said Bertie. "We're going to be in so much trouble." "Well, Bertie, why are you looking so worried today?" said Sadie the swan, gliding across the pond. "I'm fine," said Bertie. "But I must say, you look very pretty today, Sadie." Sadie blushed a little, but you couldn't really tell because, of course, her feathers don't change colour. "How kind you are, Bertie," she said. "Truly a gentleman amongst pond life." "Could you just sit over there by the side of the pond so I can admire you?" said Bertie.
and Sadie climbed out of the pond and sat down right on top of the sausages. So even when the cook searched and searched, she could not find the sausages, and she couldn't blame Bertie or Barker or any of the rest of the pond life. And Barker was so pleased when he got his sausages again. He promised not to jump into the pond and splash everybody, at least for a whole week. Now, as it happens, today's story is all about stealing things. Not that you should ever steal things, not even chocolates from the kitchen. So do you want to hear Bertie's story Nori for today? Do you really? Very well. Listen quietly, and I will tell you the story Nori of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves from a book called The 1001 Arabian Nights. In a town in Persia, there lived two brothers, one named Qasim, the other Ali Baba. Qasim was married to a rich wife and lived in luxury, while Ali Baba had to maintain his wife and children by cutting wood in a neighbouring forest and selling it in the town. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest, he saw a troop of men on horseback coming toward him in a cloud of dust. He was afraid they were robbers and climbed into a tree for safety. When they came up to him and dismounted, he counted 40 of them. They unbridled their horses and tied them to trees. The finest man among them, whom Ali Baba took to be their captain, went a little way among some bushes and said, "Open, sesame!" so plainly that Ali Baba heard him. A door opened in the rocks, and having made the troop go in, he followed them, and the door shut again of itself. They stayed inside some time, and Ali Baba, fearing they might come out and catch him, was forced to sit patiently in the tree. At last the door opened again, and the 40 thieves came out. As the captain went in last, he came out first and made them all pass by him. He then closed the door, saying, "Shut, sesame!" Every man bridled his horse and mounted. The captain put himself at their head, and they returned as they came. Then Ali Baba climbed down and went to the door concealed amongst the bushes and said, "Open, sesame!" And it flew open. Ali Baba, who expected a dull, dismal place, was greatly surprised to find it large and well lighted, hollowed by the hand of a man in the form of a vault, which received light from an opening in the ceiling. He saw rich bales of merchandise, silk, stuffed brocades all piled together, and gold and silver in heaps, and money in leather purses. He went in, and the door shut behind him. He did not look at the silver, but brought out as many bags of gold as he thought his asses, which were browsing outside, could carry, loaded them with bags, and hid all with faggots. Using the words, "Shut, sesame!" he closed the door and went home. Then he drove his asses into the yard, shut the gates, carried the money bags to his wife, and emptied them out before her. He bade her keep the secret, and he would go and bury the gold. "Let me first measure it," said his wife. "I will go borrow a measure of someone while you dig the hole." So she ran to the wife of Qasim and borrowed a measure. Knowing Ali Baba's poverty, the sister was curious to find out what sort of grain his wife wished to measure, and artfully put some toffee at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home and set the measure on the heap of gold and filled it and emptied it often to her great content. She then carried it back to her sister without noticing that a piece of gold was sticking to it, which Qasim's wife noticed directly as soon as her back was turned. She grew very curious and said to Qasim when he came home, "Qasim, your brother is richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it." He begged her to explain this riddle, which she did by showing him the piece of money and telling him where she found it. Then Cassim grew so envious that he could not sleep, and went to his brother in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," he said, showing him the gold piece, "you pretend to be poor, and yet you measure gold." By this Ali Baba perceived that through his wife's folly, Cassim and his wife knew their secret, so he confessed all and offered Cassim a share. "That I accept," said Cassim, "but I must know where to find the treasure, otherwise I will discover all, and you will lose all." Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear, told him of the cave and the very words to use. Cassim left Ali Baba, meaning to get the treasure for himself. He rose early next morning and set out with 10 mules loaded with great chests. He soon found the place and the door in the rock. He said, "Open, sesame!" And the door opened and shut behind him. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the treasures, but he now hastened to gather together as much of it as possible. But when he was ready to go, he could not remember what to say for thinking of his great riches. Instead of sesame, he said, "Open, barley!" And the door remained fast. He named several different sorts of grain, all but the right one, and the door still stuck fast. He was so frightened about the danger he was in that he had as much forgotten the world as if he had never heard it. About noon the robbers returned to their cave and saw Cassim's mules roving about with great chests on their backs. This gave them the alarm. They drew their sabres and went to the door, which opened on their captain, saying, "Open, sesame!" Cassim, who had heard the trampling of their horses' feet, resolved to sell his life dearly. So when the door opened, he leapt out and threw the captain down. In vain, however, the robbers with their sabres soon killed him. On entering the cave, they saw all the bags laid ready, and could not imagine how anyone had got in without knowing their secret. They cut Cassim's body into 4 quarters, in order to frighten anyone who should venture in, and went away in search of more treasure. As night drew, Cassim's wife grew very uneasy, and ran to her brother-in-law and told him where her husband had gone. Ali Baba did his best to comfort her, and set out to the forest in search of Cassim. The first thing he saw on entering the cave was his dead brother. Full of horror, he put the body on one of his asses, and bags of gold on the other 2, and covering all with some faggots, returned home. He drove the 2 asses laden with gold into his own yard, and led the other 2 to Cassim's house. The door was opened by the slave Morgiana, whom he knew to be both brave and cunning. Unloading the ass, he said to her, "This is the body of your master, who has been murdered, but whom we must bury as though he had died in his bed. I will speak with you again, but now tell your mistress I am come." The wife of Cassim, on learning the fate of her husband, broke out into tears and cries. But Ali Baba offered to take her to live with him and his wife, whereupon she agreed and dried her eyes. Morgiana, meanwhile, sought a doctor and asked him for some lozenges. "My poor master," she said, "can neither speak nor eat." She carried home the lozenges and returned next day weeping, and asked for an essence only given to those just about to die. Thus in the evening no one was surprised to hear the wretched shrieks and cries of Cassim's wife and Morgiana, telling everyone that Cassim was dead. The next day, after Morgiana went to an old cobbler near the gates of the town, who opened his stall early, put a piece of gold in his hand, and bade him follow her with his needle and thread. Having bound his eyes with the handkerchief, she took him to the room where the body lay, pulled off the bandage, and bade him sew the quarters together, after which she covered his eyes again and led him home. Then they buried Cassim, and Morgiana, his slave, followed him to the grave, weeping and tearing her hair, while Cassim's wife stayed at home, uttering lamentable cries. Next day she went to live with Ali Baba, who gave Cassim's shop to his eldest son. The 40 thieves, on their return to the cave, were much astonished to find Cassim's body gone and some of their money bags. "We are certainly discovered," said the captain, "and shall be undone if we cannot find out who it is that knows our secret. 2 men must have known it. We have killed one, we must now find the other. To this end, one of you who is bold and artful must go into the city dressed as a traveller, and discover whom we have killed, and whether men talk of the strange manner of his death. If the messenger fails, he must lose his life, lest we be betrayed." One of the thieves started up and offered to do this, and after the rest had highly commended him for his bravery, he disguised himself, and happened to enter the town at daybreak, just by Baba Mustapha's stall. The thief bade him good day, saying, "Honest man, how can you possibly see to stitch at your age?" "Old as I am," replied the cobbler, "I have very good eyes, and will you believe me when I tell you that I sewed a dead body together in a place where I had less light than I have now?" The robber was overjoyed at his good fortune, and giving him a piece of gold, desired to be shown the house where he stitched up the dead body. At first Mustapha refused, saying that he had been blindfolded. But when the robber gave him another piece of gold, he began to think he might remember the turnings if blindfolded as before. This means succeeded. The robber partly led him, and was partly guided by him, right in front of Cassim's house, the door of which the robber marked with a piece of chalk. Then, well pleased, he bade farewell to Baba Mustapha and returned to the forest. By and by, Morgiana, going out, saw the mark the robber had made, quickly guessed that some mischief was brewing, and fetching a piece of chalk, marked 2 or 3 doors on each side. The thief, meantime, told his comrades of his discovery. The captain thanked him, and bade him show him the house he had marked. But when they came to it, they saw that 5 or 6 of the houses were chalked in the same manner. The guide was so confused that he knew not what answer to make, and when they returned he was at once beheaded for having failed. Another robber was sent out, and having won over Baba Mustapha, marked the house in red chalk. But as Morgiana was again too clever for them, the second messenger was put to death also. The captain now resolved to go himself, but, wiser than the others, he did not mark the house, but looked at it so closely that he could not fail to remember it. He returned, and ordered his men to go into the neighbouring villages and buy 19 mules and 38 leather jars, all empty except one, which was full of oil. The captain put one of his men, fully armed, into each, rubbing the outside of the jars with oil. Then the 19 mules were loaded with 37 robbers in jars, and the jar of oil, and reached the town by dusk. The captain stopped his mules in front of Ali Baba's house, and said to Ali Baba, who was sitting outside for coolness, "I have brought some oil from a distance to sell at tomorrow's market, but it is now so late that I know not where to pass the night, unless you will do me the favour to take me in." Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the robbers in the forest, he did not recognize him in the disguise of an oil merchant. He bade him welcome, opened his gates for the mules to enter, and went to Morgiana to bid her prepare a bed and supper for his guest. He brought the stranger into his hall, and after they had supped, went again to speak to Morgiana in the kitchen, while the captain went into the yard under pretence of seeing after his mules, but really to tell his men what to do. Beginning at the first jar and ending at the last, he said to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones from the window of the chamber where I lie, cut the jars open with your knives and come out, and I will be with you in a trice." He returned to the house, and Morgiana led him to his chamber. She then told Abdullah, her fellow slave, to set on the pot some broth for her master, who had gone to bed. Meanwhile her lamp went out, and she had no more oil in the house. "Do not be uneasy," said Abdullah. "Go into the yard and take some out of one of those jars." Morgiana thanked him for his advice, took the oil pot, and went into the yard. When she came to the first jar, the robber inside said softly, "Is it time?" Any other slave but Morgiana, on finding a man in the jar instead of the oil she wanted, would have screamed and made a noise. But she, knowing the danger her master was in, bethought herself of a plan and answered quietly, "Not yet, but presently." She went to all the jars, giving the same answer, till she came to the jar of oil. She now saw that her master, thinking to entertain an oil merchant, had let 38 robbers into his house. She filled her oil pot, went back to the kitchen, and having lit her lamp, went again to the oil jar and filled a large kettle full of oil. When it boiled, she went and poured enough oil into every jar to stifle and kill the robber inside. When this brave deed was done, she went back to the kitchen, put out the fire and the lamp, and waited to see what would happen. In a quarter of an hour, the captain of the robbers awoke, got up and opened the window. As all seemed quiet, he threw down some little pebbles which hit the jars. He listened, and as none of his men seemed to stir, he grew quite uneasy and went down into the yard. On going to the first jar and saying, "Are you asleep?" he smelt the hot boiled oil and knew at once that his plot to murder Ali Baba and his household had been discovered. He found all the gang was dead, and missing the oil out of the last jar, became aware of the manner of their death. He then forced the lock of a door leading into the garden, climbed over several walls and made his escape. Morgiana heard and saw all this, and rejoicing at her success, went to bed and fell asleep. At daybreak Ali Baba arose, and seeing the oil jar still there, asked why the merchant had not gone with his mules. Morgiana bade him look in the first jar and see if there was any oil. Seeing a man, he started back in terror. "Have no fear," said Morgiana. "The man cannot harm you. He is dead." Ali Baba, when he had recovered somewhat from his astonishment, asked what had become of the merchant. "Merchant?" said she. "He is no more merchant than I am." And she told him the whole story, assuring him that it was a plot of the robbers of the forest, of whom only 3 were left, and that the white and red chalk marks had something to do with it. Ali Baba at once gave Morgiana her freedom, saying that he owed her his life. Then they buried the bodies in Ali Baba's garden, while the mules were sold in the market by his slaves. The captain returned to his lonely cave, which seemed frightful to him without his lost companions, and firmly resolved to avenge them by killing Ali Baba. He dressed himself carefully and went into town, where he took lodgings in an inn. In the course of a great many journeys to the forest, he carried away many rich stuffs and much fine linen, and set up a shop opposite that of Ali Baba's son. He called himself Khoja Hassan, and as he was both civil and well dressed, he soon made friends with Ali Baba's son, and through him with Ali Baba, whom he was continually asking to sup with him. Ali Baba, wishing to return his kindness, invited him into his house and received him smiling, thanking him for his kindness to his son. When the merchant was about to take his leave, Ali Baba stopped him, saying, "Where are you going, sir, in such a haste? Will you not stay and sup with me?" The merchant refused, saying that he had a reason, and on Ali Baba's asking him what that was, he replied, it is, sir, that I can eat no food that has salt in it." "If that is all," said Ali Baba, "let me tell you that there shall be no salt in either the meat or the bread that we eat tonight." He went to give this order to Morgiana, who was much surprised. "Who is this man," said she, "who eats no salt with his meat?" "He is an honest man, Morgiana," returned her master. "Therefore do as I bid you." But she could not withstand a desire to see this strange man, so she helped Abdullah to carry up the dishes and saw in a moment that Khoja Hassan was the robber captain and carried a dagger under his robes. "I am not surprised," she said to herself, "that this wicked man who intends to kill my master will eat no salt with him, but I will hinder his plans." She sent up the supper by Abdullah, while she made ready for one of the boldest acts that could be thought on. When the dessert had been served, Khoja Hassan was left alone with Ali Baba and his son, whom he thought to make drunk, and then to murder them. Morgiana, meanwhile, put on a headdress like a dancing girl's, and clasped a belt round her waist, from which hung a dagger with a silver hilt. And she said to Abdullah, "Take your guitar, and let us go and divert our master and his guest." Abdullah took his guitar and played before Morgiana until they came to the door, where Abdullah stopped playing, and Morgiana made a low curtsy. "Come in, Morgiana," said Ali Baba, "and let Khoja Hassan see what you can do." And turning to Khoja Hassan, he said, "She's my slave and my housekeeper." Khoja Hassan was by no means pleased, for he feared that his chance of killing Ali Baba was gone for the present. But he pretended eagerness to see Morgiana, and Abdallah began to play and Morgiana to dance. After she had performed several dances, she drew her dagger and made passes with it, sometimes pointing it at her own breast, sometimes at her master's, as if it were part of the dance. Suddenly, out of breath, she snatched the guitar from Abdallah with her left hand, and holding the dagger in her right hand, held out the guitar to her master. Ali Baba and his son put a piece of gold into it, and Khoja Hassan, seeing that she was coming to him, pulled out his purse to make her a present. But while he was putting his hand into it, Morgiana plunged the dagger into his heart. "Unhappy girl!" cried Ali Baba and his son. "What have you done to ruin us?" "It was to preserve you, master, not to ruin you," answered Morgiana. "See here." Opening the false merchant's garment and showing the dagger, "See what an enemy you have entertained. Remember he would eat no salt with you. And what more would you have? Look at him. He is both the false oil merchant and the captain of 40 thieves." Ali Baba was so grateful to Morgiana for thus saving his life that he offered her to his son in marriage, who readily consented, and after a few days the wedding was celebrated with greatest splendour. At the end of the year, Ali Baba, hearing nothing of the 2 remaining robbers, judged that they were dead and set out to the cave. The door opened on his saying, "Open, Sesame!" He went in and saw that nobody had been there since the captain left it. He brought away as much gold as he could carry and returned to the town. He told his son the secret of the cave, which his son handed down in his turn, So the children and grandchildren of Ali Baba were rich to the end of their lives. And that was the story Nori of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves from the 1001 Arabian Nights. I thought it was very exciting. Did you? If you would like to find out more about Bertie and his friends, you can drop by and visit him on his website at storynori.com. While you are there, you can also drop into Bertie's online shop. I'll be back with another Story Nori soon. Until then, from me, Natasha. Bye-bye.
Hansel and Gretel. Hi everybody, my name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you a story Nori. It's a rather scary story. Do you like rather scary stories? You won't be frightened, will you? Just a bit? Because you know, I think I'm going to be just a bit scared when I tell you about the wicked witch who liked to eat little children. So listen quietly, and I will tell you the story Nori of Hansel and Gretel from Andrew Lang's Blue Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there lived on the outskirts of a large forest a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel and the girl Gretel. He always had very little money, even to buy food, and once, when times were really bad, they had to get by with 1 piece of bread and butter each day. One night, as he was tossing about in bed, full of cares and worry, he sighed and said to his wife, "What's to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children, now that we have nothing more for ourselves?" "I tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we'll take the children out into the thickest part of the wood. There we shall light a fire for them and give them each a piece of bread. Then we'll go on to our work and leave them alone. They won't be able to find their way home, and we shall be rid of them." "No, wife," said her husband, "that I won't do. How could I find it in my heart to leave my children alone in the wood? The wild beasts would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, you fool," said she, "then we must all 4 die of hunger, and you may just as well go and saw the wood for our coffins." And they argued and argued until he agreed that they must get rid of Hansel and Gretel. "But I can't help feeling sorry for the poor children," added the husband. The children, too, had not been able to sleep for hunger and had heard what their stepmother had said to her father. Gretel wept bitterly and spoke to Hansel. "Now it's all over for us." "No, no, Gretel," said Hansel. "Don't worry. I'll find a way to escape. No fear." And when the parents had fallen asleep, he got up, slipped on his little coat, opened the back door, and crept out. The moon was shining clearly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like bits of silver. Hansel bent down and filled his pocket with as many of them as he could cram in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "It's all right, my dear little sister, and go to sleep. God will not desert us." And he lay down in bed again. At daybreak, even before the sun was up, the woman came and woke the 2 children. "Get up, you sleepyheads. We're all going to the forest to fetch wood." She gave them each a bit of bread and said, "There's something for your lunch, but don't you eat it up before lunchtime, because it's all you'll get." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. After they had walked for a little, Hansel stood still and looked back at the house, and all the while he kept on holding back again and again.
His father observed him and said, "Hansel, what are you gazing at there? And why do you always remain behind? Take care and don't lose your way." "Oh, father," said Hansel, "I'm looking back at my white kitten, which is sitting on the roof, waving me bye-bye." The woman exclaimed, "What a donkey you are! That isn't your kitten. That's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel had not looked back at his kitten. But each time he stopped, he had dropped one of the white pebbles out of his pocket to mark the way back home, so that he and little Gretel could not get lost in the woods. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, go and fetch a lot of wood, and I'll light a fire that you may not feel cold." Hansel and Gretel heaped up brushwood till they had made a pile nearly the size of a small hill. The brushwood was set fire to, and when the flames leaped high, the woman said, "Now lie down at the fire, children, and rest yourselves. We are going into the forest to cut down wood. When we've finished, we'll come back and fetch you." But instead, the old parents crept back to their cottage, leaving the children behind. Hansel and Gretel sat down beside the fire, and at midday ate their little bits of bread. And when they had sat for a long time, their eyes closed with tiredness, and they fell fast asleep. When they awoke at last, it was pitch dark. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we ever going to get out of the wood?" But Hansel comforted her. "Wait a bit," he said, "till the moon is up, and then we'll find our way sure enough." And when the full moon had risen, he took his sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like bright new coins, and showed them the path. They walked on through the night, and at daybreak reached their father's house again. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it, she exclaimed, "You naughty children! What a long time you've slept in the wood! We thought you were never going to come back." But the father rejoiced, for he felt guilty for leaving his children behind them. Not long afterward, there was again a great shortage of food in the land, and the children heard their mother speak to their father in bed one night like this: "Everything is eaten up once more. We have only half a loaf of bread in the house, and when that's done, it's all up with us. The children must be got rid of. We'll lead them deeper into the wood this time, so that they won't be able to find their way out again. There's no other way of saving ourselves." The man's heart felt heavy, and he thought, surely it would be better to share the last bite with one's children. But his wife wouldn't listen to his arguments, and they quarrelled for a long time until the old man finally agreed that the children had to be got rid of, although he was very sad about it. But the children were awake and had heard the conversation. When the old people were asleep, Hansel got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles again, as he had done the first time, but the woman had barred the door, and Hansel couldn't get out. But he consoled his little sister and said, "Don't cry, Gretel, and sleep peacefully, for God is sure to help us." At early dawn, the woman came and made the children get up. She gave them their bit of bread, but it was even smaller than the time before. On the way to the wood, Hansel crumbled it in his pocket, and every few minutes he stood still and dropped a crumb on the ground. "Hansel, what are you stopping and looking about you for?" said the father. "I'm looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof waving me farewell," answered Hansel. "Fool!" said the wife. "That isn't your pigeon. It's the morning sun glittering on the chimney." But Hansel gradually threw all his crumbs on the path. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, farther than they had ever been in their lives before. Then a big fire was lit again, and the mother said, "Just sit down there, children, and if you're tired you can sleep a bit. We're going into the forest to cut down wood, and in the evening when we're finished we'll come back to fetch you." At midday, Gretel divided her bread with Hansel, for he had strewn it all along their path. Then they fell asleep, and evening passed away, but nobody came to the poor children. They didn't wake till it was pitch dark, and Hansel comforted his sister, saying, "Only wait, Gretel, till the moon rises. Then we shall see the breadcrumbs that are scattered along the path. They will show us back to the house." When the moon appeared, they got up, but they found no crumbs, for the thousands of birds that fly about the woods and fields had picked them all up. "Never mind," said Hansel to Gretel. "You'll see we'll find a way out." But all the same they did not. They wandered about the whole night, and the next day from morning till evening, but they could not find a path out of the wood. They were very hungry too, for they had nothing to eat but a few berries they found growing on the ground. And at last they were so tired that their legs refused to carry them any longer, so they lay down under a tree and fell fast asleep. On the third morning, after they had left their father's house, they set about their wandering again, but only got deeper and deeper into the wood. And now they felt that if help did not come to them soon, they must perish. At midday, they saw a beautiful little snow-white bird sitting on a branch, which sang so sweetly that they stopped still and listened to it. And when its song was finished, it flapped its wings and flew on in front of them. They followed it and came to a little house, on the roof of which it perched. And when they came quite near, they saw that the cottage was made of bread and roofed with cakes, while the window was made of transparent sugar. "Now we'll tuck in," said Hansel, "and stuff our faces with the food. I'll eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window, which you'll find a tasty little snack." Hansel stretched up his hand and broke off a little bit of the roof to see what it was like, and Gretel went to the window and began to nibble at it. At that moment a shrill voice came out from the room inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's nibbling at my house?" The children answered, "'Tis heaven's own child, the tempest wild," and went on eating, for they were ever so hungry, and Hansel in particular had rather bad manners. He was thoroughly enjoying eating the roof, and tore down a big bit of it, while Gretel pushed out a whole round window pane and sat down the better to enjoy it. Suddenly the door opened, and an ancient woman was leaning on a stick hobbled out. Hansel and Gretel were so terrified that they let what they had in their hands fall. But the old woman shook her head and said, "Oh ho, you dear children, who led you here? Just come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into the house, and laid a most delicious dinner before them, milk and sugared pancakes with apples and nuts. After they had finished, 2 beautiful little white beds were prepared for them, and when Hansel and Gretel lay down in them, they felt as if they had got into heaven. The old woman appeared to be most friendly, but she was really an old witch who used to steal children, and had only built the little bread house in order to lure them in. When anyone came into her power, she killed, cooked, and ate him or her, and held a regular feast day for the occasion. Now witches have red eyes, and cannot see far, but like beasts, they have a keen sense of smell, and know when human beings pass by. When Hansel and Gretel fell into her hands, she laughed wickedly and said jeeringly, "I've got them now. They shan't escape me." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she rose up, and when she saw them both sleeping so peacefully with their round rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That'll be a dainty bite to eat." Then she seized Hansel with her bony hand and carried him into the little stable and locked the door on him. He might scream as much as he liked. It did him no good. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, you lazy bones! Fetch water and cook something for your brother. When he's fat, I'll eat him up." Gretel began to cry bitterly, but it was of no use. She had to do what she was told. So the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the old woman hobbled out to the stable and cried, "Hansel, put out your finger that I may feel if you are getting fat." But Hansel always stretched out an old bone, and the old dame, whose eyes were dim, couldn't see it, and thinking always it was Hansel's finger, wondered why he fattened slowly. When 4 weeks had passed, and Hansel still remained thin, she lost patience and decided to wait no longer. "Hi, Gretel," she called to the girl. "Be quick and get some water. Hansel may be fat or thin. I'm going to kill him tomorrow or cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister sobbed as she carried the water, and how the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Kind heaven, help us now," she cried. "If only the wild beasts in the wood had eaten us, then at least we should have died together." "Just hold your peace," said the old hag. "It won't help you." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the kettle full of water and light the fire. "First, we'll make a pie," said the old witch. "I've heated the oven already and rolled the pastry." She pushed Gretel out to the oven, from which fiery flames were already jumping. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it's properly heated, so that we can shove in the pie." For when she had got Gretel in, she meant to close the oven and let the girl roast, that she might eat her up too. But Gretel saw through her wicked trick and said, "I don't know how I'm going to do it. How do I get in?" "You silly goose," said the old hag. "The opening is big enough. See, I could get in myself." And she crawled toward it and poked her head in the oven. Then Gretel gave her a shove that sent her right in, shut the iron door and drew the bolt. Gracious, how she yelled! But Gretel fled, and the wretched old woman was left to roast in her own oven. Gretel flew straight to Hansel, opened the little stable door and cried, "Hansel, we are free! The old witch is dead!" Then Hansel sprang like a bird out of a cage when the door is opened. How happy they were! They jumped for joy and hugged and kissed one another. And as they had no longer any cause for fear, they went into the old hag's house. And here they found, in every corner of the room, boxes with pearls and precious stones. "These are even better than pebbles," said Hansel, and crammed his pockets full of them. And Gretel said, "I too will bring some home," and she filled her apron full. "But now," said Hansel, "let's go and get well away from the witch's wood." When they had wandered about for some hours, they came to a big lake. "We can't get over," said Hansel. "I see no bridge of any sort or kind." "Yes, and there's no ferry boat either," answered Gretel. "But look, there swims a white duck. If I ask her, she'll help us over." And she called out, "Here are 2 sad children who can't cross the lake to get home because there is no bridge nor ferry boat. Take us upon your white back and row us over. Quack, quack." The duck swam toward them, and Hansel got on her back and told his little sister to sit beside him. "No," answered Gretel. "We should be too heavy a load for the duck. She shall carry us across separately." The good bird did this, and when they were landed safely on the other side and had walked for a while, the wood became more and more familiar to them, and at last they saw their father's house in the distance. Then they set off to run, and bounding into the room jumped up to hug their father. The man had not passed a happy hour since he had left them in the wood, but his wife had died. Gretel shook out her apron so that the pearls and precious stones rolled about the room, and Hansel threw down one handful after the other out of his pocket. And so all their troubles were ended, and they lived happily ever after. And that's the story, Nori, of Hansel and Gretel. I'm glad it all ended happily, at least for Hansel and Gretel and their father, even if the wicked witch did get roasted in her own oven. Prince Bertie the Frog would like to meet all his new friends at his lovely green and purple website. You can see what he looks like there. So drop by at storynori.com. I'll be telling you another story, Nori, soon. So for now, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.
Hi, everybody. My name is Natasha, and I've been commanded by His Royal Highness Prince Bertie the Frog to tell you the story, Nori, of the elephant's child. Do you know what curiosity means? Would you like to find out? Well, I'll tell you. When you are curious, it means that you want to learn about lots and lots of things. The little elephant in this story is always asking questions, which is why he's full of insatiable curiosity. In the high and far-off times, the elephant, oh best beloved, had no trunk. He had only a blackish, bulgy nose as big as a boot that he could wriggle about from side to side, but he couldn't pick up things with it. But there was one elephant, a new elephant, an elephant's child, who was full of insatiable curiosity, and that means he asked ever so many questions. And he lived in Africa, and he filled all Africa with his insatiable curiosities. He asked his tall aunt, the ostrich, why her tail feathers grew just so, and his tall aunt, the ostrich, spanked him with her hard, hard claw. He asked his tall uncle, the giraffe, what made his skin spotty, and his tall uncle, the giraffe, spanked him with his hard, hard hoof. And still he was full of insatiable curiosity. He asked his broad aunt, the hippopotamus, why her eyes were red, and his broad aunt, the hippopotamus, spanked him with her broad, broad hoof. And he asked his hairy uncle, the baboon, why melons tasted just so, and his hairy uncle, the baboon, spanked him with his hairy, hairy paw. And still he was full of insatiable curiosity. He asked questions about everything that he saw, or heard, or felt, or smelt, or touched, and all his uncles and aunts spanked him, and still he was full of insatiable curiosity. One fine morning, in the middle of the procession of the equinoxes, this insatiable elephant's child asked a new fine question that he had never asked before. He asked, "What does the crocodile have for dinner?" Then everybody said, "Hush!" in a loud, dreadful tone, and they spanked him immediately and directly without stopping for a long time. By and by, when that was finished, he came upon Colo Colo Bird, sitting in the middle of a wait-a-bit thorn bush, and he said, "My father has spanked me, and my mother has spanked me. All my aunts and uncles have spanked me for my satiable curiosity, and still I want to know what the crocodile has for dinner." Then Colo Colo Bird said, with a mournful cry, "Go to the banks of the great grey green greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, and find out." That very next morning, when there was nothing left of the equinoxes, because the procession had proceeded according to precedent, this satiable elephant's child took 100 pounds of bananas, the little short red kind, and 100 pounds of sugar cane, the long purple kind, and 17 melons, the green crackly kind, and said to all his dear families, "Goodbye, I'm going to the great grey green greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, to find out what the crocodile has for dinner." And they all spanked him at once for luck, though he asked them most politely to stop. Then he went away, a little warm, but not at all astonished, eating melons and throwing the rind about, because he could not pick it up. He went from Grahamstown to Kimberley, and from Kimberley to Karma's country, and from Karma's country he went east by north, eating melons all the time, till at last he came to the banks of the great grey-green greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, precisely as the Colo Colo Bird had said. Now, you must know and understand, O best beloved, that till that very week and day, and hour and minute, this satiable elephant's child had never seen a crocodile, and did not know what one was like. It was all his satiable curiosity. The first thing that he found was a bi-coloured python rock snake curled around a rock. "Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but have you seen such a thing as a crocodile in these promiscuous parts?" "Have I seen a crocodile?" said the bi-coloured python rock snake in a voice of dreadful scorn. "What will you ask me next?" "Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but could you kindly tell me what he has for dinner?" Then the bi-coloured python rock snake uncoiled himself very quickly from the rock and spanked the elephant child with his scalesome, flailsome tail. "That is odd," said the elephant's child, "because my father and mother and my uncle and aunt, not to mention my other aunt, the hippopotamus, and my other uncle, the baboon, have all spanked me for my satiable curiosity, and I suppose this is the same thing." So he said goodbye very politely to the bi-coloured python rock snake, and helped to coil him up on the rock again, and went on, a little warm, but not at all astonished, eating melons and throwing the rind about, because he could not pick it up, till he trod on what he thought was a log of wood at the very edge of the great grey green greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees. But it was really the crocodile, O best beloved, and the crocodile winked one eye like this. "Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but do you happen to have seen a crocodile in these promiscuous parts?" Then the crocodile winked the other eye and lifted half his tail out of the mud, and the elephant's child stepped back most politely, because he did not wish to be spanked again. "Come hither, little one," said the crocodile. Why do you ask such things?"
"Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but my father has spanked me, my mother has spanked me, not to mention my tall aunt the ostrich and my tall uncle the giraffe, who can kick ever so hard, as well as my broad aunt the hippopotamus, and my hairy uncle the baboon, and including the bi-coloured python rock snake with the scalesome, flailsome tail just up the bank, who spanks harder than any of them, and so, if it's quite all the same to you, I don't want to be spanked any more."
"Come hither, little one," said the crocodile, "for I am the crocodile." And he wept crocodile tears to show it was quite true. Then the elephant child grew all breathless and panted, and kneeled down on the bank and said, "You are the very person I have been looking for all these long days. Will you please tell me what you have for dinner?" "Come hither, little one," said the crocodile, "and I'll whisper." Then the elephant's child put his head down close to the crocodile's musky, tusky mouth, and the crocodile caught him by his little nose, which up to that very week, day, hour, and minute had been no bigger than a boot, though much more useful. "I think," said the crocodile, and he said it between his teeth like this, "I think today I will begin with the elephant's child." At this, oh best beloved, the elephant's child was much annoyed, and he said, speaking through his nose like this, "Let go! You are hurting me!" Then the bi-coloured python rock snake scuffled down from the bank and said, "My young friend, if you do not now, immediately and instantly pull as hard as you ever can, it is my opinion that your acquaintance in the large pattern leather ulster," and by this he meant crocodile, "will jerk you into yonder limpid stream before you can say Jack Robinson." This is the way that bi-coloured python rock snakes always talk. Then the elephant's child sat back on his little haunches and pulled and pulled and pulled, and his nose began to stretch, and the crocodile floundered in the water, making it all creamy with great sweeps of his tail, and he pulled and pulled, and the elephant child's nose kept on stretching, and the elephant child spread all his little four legs and pulled and pulled and pulled, and his nose kept on stretching, and the crocodile threshed his tail like an oar, and he pulled and pulled and pulled, and at each pull the elephant child's nose grew longer and longer, and it hurt him hideous. Then the elephant's child felt his legs slipping, and he said through his nose, which was now nearly 5 feet long, "This is too much for me." Then the bi-coloured python rock snake came down from the bank and knotted himself in a double clove hitch round the elephant child's hind legs and said, "Rash and inexperienced traveller, we will now seriously devote ourselves to a little high tension, because if we do not, it is my impression that yonder self-repelling man of war with the armour-plated upper deck," and by this, O best beloved, he meant the crocodile, "will permanently vitiate your future career." This is the way all bi-coloured python rock snakes always talk. So he pulled, and the elephant's child pulled, and the crocodile pulled, but the elephant's child and the bi-coloured python rock snake pulled hardest, and at last the crocodile let go of the elephant's child's nose with a plop that you could hear all up and down the Limpopo. Then the elephant's child sat down most hard and sudden, but first he was careful to say "Thank you" to the bi-coloured python rock snake, and next he was kind to his poor pulled nose, and wrapped it up all in cool banana leaves, and hung it in the great grey-green, greasy Limpopo to cool.
"What are you doing that for?" said the bi-coloured python rock snake.
"Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but my nose is badly out of shape, and I am waiting for it to shrink."
"Then you will have to wait a long time," said the bi-coloured python rock snake. "Some people do not know what is good for them."
The elephant's child sat there for 3 days waiting for his nose to shrink, but it never grew any shorter, and besides, it made him squint. For, oh, best beloved, you will see and understand that the crocodile had pulled it out into a really true trunk, same as all elephants have today. At the end of the 3rd day, a fly came and stung him on the shoulder, and before he knew what he was doing, he lifted up his trunk and hit that fly dead with the end of it.
"Vantage number 1, said the bi-coloured python rock snake. "You couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Try and eat a little now."
Before he thought what he was doing, the elephant's child put out his trunk and plucked a large bundle of grass, dusted it clean against his forelegs, and stuffed it into his own mouth.
"Vantage number 2, said the bi-coloured python rock snake. "You couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Don't you think the sun is very hot here?"
"It is," said the elephant's child, and before he thought what he was doing, he scooped up a scoop of mud from the banks of the great grey-green greasy Limpopo and slapped it on his head, where it made a cool, sloopy, sloshy mudcap, all trickly behind his ears.
"Vantage number 3, said the bi-coloured python rock snake. "You couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Now how do you feel about being spanked again?"
"Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but I should not like it at all."
"How would you like to spank somebody?" said the bi-coloured python rock snake.
"I should like it very much indeed," said the elephant's child.
"Well," said the bi-coloured python rock snake,
"you will find that new nose of yours very useful to spank people with." "Thank you," said the elephant's child. "I'll remember that. And now I think I'll go home to all my dear families and try." So the elephant's child went home across Africa, frisking and whisking his trunk. When he wanted fruit to eat, he pulled fruit down from a tree, instead of waiting for it to fall as he used to. When he wanted grass, he plucked grass up from the ground, instead of going on his knees as he used to. When the flies bit him, he broke off the branch of a tree and used it as a fly whisk, and he made himself a new, cool, slushy, scushy mudcap wherever the sun was hot. When he felt lonely walking through Africa, he sang to himself down his trunk, and the noise was louder than several brass bands. He went especially out of his way to find a broad hippopotamus. She was no relation of his, and he spanked her very hard to make sure that the bi-coloured python rock snake had spoken the truth about his new trunk. The rest of the time he picked up the melon rinds that he had dropped on his way to the Limpopo, for he was a tidy pachyderm. One dark evening he came back to all his dear families, and he coiled up his trunk and said, "How do you do?" They were very glad to see him, and immediately said, "Come here and be spanked for your satiable curiosity." "Pooh," said the elephant's child. "I don't think you peoples know anything about spanking, but I do, and I'll show you." Then he uncurled his trunk and knocked 2 of his dear brothers head over heels. "Oh, bananas," said they. "Where did you learn that trick? And what have you done to your nose?" "I got a new one from the crocodile on the banks of the great grey-green greasy Limpopo River,"
said the elephant's child. "I asked him what he had for dinner, and he gave me this to keep." "It looks very ugly," said his hairy uncle the baboon. "It does," said the elephant's child, "but it's very useful." And he picked up his hairy uncle the baboon by one hairy leg and hove him into a hornet's nest. Then that bad elephant's child spanked all his dear families for a long time, till they were very warm and greatly astonished. He pulled out his tall ostrich aunt's tail feathers, and he caught his tall uncle the giraffe by the hind leg and dragged him through a thorn bush. And he shouted at his broad aunt, the hippopotamus, and blew bubbles into her ear when she was sleeping in the water after meals. But he never let anyone touch Colo Colo Bird. At last things grew so exciting that his dear families went off one by one in a hurry to the great banks of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, to borrow new noses from the crocodile. When they came back, nobody spanked anybody any more, and ever since that day, oh best beloved, all the elephants you will ever see, besides all those that you won't, have trunks precisely like the trunk of the satiable elephant's child. And that was the story Nori of the elephant's child, from the Just So stories of Rudyard Kipling. And so now you know how the elephant got his trunk. Were you curious to find out? I was, and so was Tim the Tadpole. If you would like to find out more about Bertie and his friends, you can drop by and visit him on his website at storynori.com. So don't forget to drop by at storynori.com and tell all your friends to go there too. I'll be back with another Story Nori soon. For now, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.